Well, you're right, Connor. What's the matter?
I don't.
He doesn't get it.
I don't understand this.
Well,
I don't.
It's not your fault. It's not your fault.
I don't want your life.
Hey, welcome to iFanboy, the video podcast from the discussion site iFanboy.com. I don't remember what comes after that.
You're Josh.
Yeah.
I'm Ron.
I'm Conor.
I was so proud of myself. I was like, oh, I fucking did it.
It's not your fault.
It's not your fault.
Okay, so we were sitting around the iFanboy HQ planning our next, what episodes we wanted to do, and Josh mentioned Understanding Comics. By
Josh.
That's Josh. By Scott Mccloud. And so we said, hey, I'm a big fan of the series of books. Connor's never read them, so we figured we'd talk about it and share our thoughts about it.
And Connor's thing was, why would I read this?
Yeah. Well, before we get into that, we should explain who Scott Mccloud is and what the book is. But it's a very sort of similar and important work.
Yeah.
I think.
So it's called Understanding Comics. It's written and drawn by Scott Mccloud. And it's been published by a bunch of different publishers. Kitchen Sink first published it in 1993, and since then it's been reprinted, I think, by Harper Perennial. And as for Scott Mccloud, who is Scott Mccloud?
Scott Mccloud is a writer, artist, cartoonist who has been making comics since sort of the early 80s.
Yeah.
He first came to prominence with a cult comic called Zot, which was sort of a lighthearted sci-fi comic, which was, they said, to be sort of, as comics and mainstream comics are going grittier and grittier, he was sort of doing something to counter that.
And that was part of the big kind of mid-'80s black and white boom.
Yeah.
Kind of independent comics.
Cerebus, Ninja Turtles, he was part of that. And then in 1993, he came to prominence by doing Understanding Comics, which was the first real look into what it is about comics. It's sort of almost an academic treatise on what it is that comics are. Except for Will Eisner, which he credits, had done a couple of books prior to that, doing sort of the same thing.
It was the most modern kind of exploration of comics as a medium in terms of basically trying to, how do we understand comics? How do we understand these things that we read?
And the other thing is, it really is an academic text. Now, I don't want to make that sound boring because it's not. But really, it's very metaphysical. It goes, we're going to get into this a little bit. But it's done in the form of comics, which is what makes it sort of revolutionary.
Yeah, he drew it. And what's really interesting is that he uses his own art style, and he's got his own little kind of how he draws himself. And
his avatar narrates us all through the thing.
And it's drawn in panels, much like comics, and he uses that to explain the medium as well in a very kind of clever way. And he also mixes in work of other artists in terms of comparisons and things like that. And I also like it when he draws in the style of other artists and stuff like that. That's cute. But anyway,
so Conor, what was your take on it before?
Well, I've always heard of this book, and there's a trilogy. So it's Reinventing Comics.
Yeah, there was Understanding Comics, Reinventing Comics, and
Making Comics in 2006.
Yeah, that's his new one.
In 1993 was Understanding Comics. Reinventing Comics was 2000.
And we don't have
a little more controversial, and we don't have Making Comics.
We'll get into the other books later.
So it's something I've always heard about. 93. It's been around
15
years.
Yeah.
I knew what it was, which is basically something that explained how you read comics, how your brain processes words and pictures, and how these things work. So I've always heard of that, but for me, I always thought, why do I need to read this book if I already understand comics?
May I? Okay. I would say the first thing in going is that a lot of times, and this is what I sort of learned in college when you take film classes and things like that.
Oh, we're getting into film school.
Well, it is very much like that because what it is, it's explaining a lot of the subconscious things that happen when you read comics. So as you're going, he really makes a point of distinguishing comics. Starting off by defining them, but distinguishing them from other forms of media. There's words and there's pictures and there's comics that do something that none of those things do, and sort of the processes that take place in the mind and what makes that important.
Yeah, to chime in quickly, you just read it recently.
I just reread it.
Okay. This is actually my copy that I stole from my public library in 1993 or 1994. It's dated December 1993, so it's somewhere in there. I had been seriously reading comics for maybe 5 years at that point, and I had the similar thought. I'm a punk. I'm in high school, and I stole a book, and statute of limitations is over, so I'm going with it. Although my mom works at the library now, so I'm screwed. Anyway,
oh my God, it's Bookman, the librarian comic.
So I've been reading comics, and I had a much similar attitude where I know how to read comics. What is that? But I'm like, oh, check it out. It blew my mind because it made me think about comics in a way that I had never thought about much in the way that those distinguishing factors. And when looking at it, you could very easily say someone who you know who doesn't read comics or doesn't get comics, they give this to them, they'll understand comics. But I think this is just as important for somebody who reads comics to understand what is going into it, both in terms of from an artistic and storytelling. It gave me terms that I'd never heard of, like sequential storytelling.
Yeah. An Eisner term. Sequential art is a Will Eisner coined term.
It made me understand that. It made me understand dynamics between what makes a comic in terms of the pacing and we'll talk about it. But it was just blew my mind.
Just for example, one of the very first thing that comes up in the book is he talks about the power that in comics a lot of time there's a writer and an artist, or they're both the same person. And they're telling you what happened, but really a lot of what happens comes from you as the reader, which makes them unique because. He uses an example. There's a little thing. He has themes, and they keep showing up over and over in the book. One of them is it's a little picture of a man with a hat, and then the next frame is the hat's over here. And what he's suggesting is that your mind fills in what happens between those two spaces.
And that blew my mind.
Right, because you don't think about it; you do it automatically.
Yeah, and it's that juxtaposition of time, and that, like you said, in looking at those two panels, you see the guy with the hat, and you see it like that. Your mind says, okay, he lifted the hat up off of his head.
Right.
And
he goes on to have other examples where he shows you like some different panels where if an axe murderer, he shows a guy with an axe, and then you cut away to a scream. Now your mind fills in what that is, and that's something that comics do in a way that nothing else does. Those are sort of the basic things at the beginning, and then he gets into extrapolations of what time means to read in comics, just for example, is another thing, which I found really interesting.
Well, and I think it's similar to the section where he often, similar to the guy with the hat, he uses a simple story. And like, for example, there's one story of a guy hanging out with a girl, drinking, and he drives home, and then he crashes his car.
Right.
And he shows how you can tell that story, and it kind of ties into modern day, because we've heard a lot about like Bendis decompressing comics, and things don't really happen the way time passes. And he's shown you could do that story in 3 panels. You could do that story in 25.
Yeah.
And I found that to be really, like how time is managed in comics. I never really thought about that, because time does elapse. And like, for example, Astonishing X-Men, we talk about, the first, the whole 24 issues, I think so far, have taken over the span of about a week in terms of comics, even though it's taken 3 years to come out.
Right.
Whereas in the standard X-Men comics, it could be, several months pass between 2 issues.
I'm here to help you understand promos. Just in case you're not exactly clear on what has to happen. With the promo, I describe a good or a service, something that you might want, and then you, because you trust me or you see me as some type of authority figure, you take my recommendation and you follow through, purchasing whatever good or service I recommend. Example, you say, I need domain names, to which I say, you should head over to www.godaddy.com. You can get all the domain names you need there. You can get all sorts of stuff there. And then you say, hey, that's a great idea. And you get out your computer, unless it's already out because you're watching this video. So presumably it's already out. So you're on your computer, you head over there, and then I say, you should enter the coupon code iFanboy. You get 10% off your entire purchase. It's a win-win for everyone involved. So do it.
Is this a book that's helpful for people who are trying to make comics?
That was my next thing that I was going to say. If you are out there and you're thinking at all of writing comics, you would really be remiss to not read this.
Yes.
Because one of the things he does is he explores, there's a history of comics that people don't realize. And sort of the first, like in the 1850s, the sort of the first words and pictures being put together. But then he goes way back to ancient art, or, like original
hieroglyphics and things like that.
Pictograms, things like that. Those are all actually comics, by his definition.
And he also importantly notes that, in terms of modern days, he's, X-Men and Superman and Batman and stuff like that are held in the same regard as Walt Kelly's Pogo and strip comics and stuff like that. So.
And then he goes even further
Betty
to say
Veronica,
that
Archie.
in a place like Japan, where it was sort of a secluded place, comics evolved in a completely different way than they did here. Yeah. And so they had all different devices for distinguishing emotion or distinguishing time passing or motion,
speed.
Things like that.
This is where I learned about speed lines.
Yeah, and what is really interesting is that the book was written in 1992. Yeah. Now, in that time, it doesn't read like I just read it 3 days ago. I finished. Yes, I finished it yesterday again, and before that I hadn't read it.
2 minutes before the show started.
But no, I read it about 7 or 8 years ago, and I just read it again and finished it yesterday. And a lot of the things that it still holds up. It doesn't feel dated.
Well, I
at
think
all.
that's universal. I mean, comics are universal in their structure, so it's going to hold. I mean,
well, no, but what I was about to say is that what he does, he goes into some things that he talks about that they did in Japan that had come up in the regular language of Japanese comics. The speed lines being one. One would be like relative speed. There's one place where he shows motion, where he's showing you all these different ways that a character can be shown to be in motion. Yep. One of them is like, you know, the Flash thing where there's like a Flash and then behind him are 3 other poses
Flashes,
of that. Yeah. And then there's, I think it's relative motion, where the character in the middle is not moving, but behind them the background is a blur, and that comes from Japanese comics. It didn't exist in American comics. It does now. Yeah,
I was just gonna say, and if you look at the work, like the Luna Brothers do that a lot, where like they blur the background, but the characters in the front are prominent and stuff like that. That has been integrated into our comics, so it's kind of cool to see how that stands up. But it's interesting not only from a writing perspective to understand that the way time is, but I think artists also, while this isn't a clear text on how to draw, he really focuses on like the spectrum between cartoony versus realistic drawing.
He's got a real thing he's got these triangle diagrams. And this is when it starts to get really...
I loved it.
It does. It starts to get very metaphysical, and he does do a thing where he sort of says, this is how it is. There are 6 steps, and you sort of have to buy it. It's not bad.
Yeah. Well, that's with the transitions.
Right. That's just one kind of thing.
Yeah.
So with the triangle, he's basically got a triangle, and on one side is a literal picture, like this is a photo. And then the next step over is a slightly realistic photo, and then as you go over more towards the cartoony or iconic, it's a circle with 2 dots and a line, and that's a face.
But what's really cool about it is that he takes that triangle and that span, and he lays out, and you can see from the photo to the smiley face, you see a Neil Adams face, which is kind of photorealistic.
Right.
And you see Charles Schultz, which is kind of like and Dave Mazzucchelli, and and different artists as they fit in that spectrum.
Which is just practically it's in the middle of the things.
But
basically shows where all of these famous artists, and it's notated where they all fit within the scheme of his
the
triangle.
spectrum.
I'm trying to remember, and then the top is abstract, I believe.
Yes. Yeah.
As opposed to
So not only is this good for understanding how your brain works when reading comics, but it's good from a structural standpoint. If you really want to understand how to make good comics, this is a good resource for that.
It's not so much a treatise on, for example, how to structure or pace a good story. It's not like how to write comics.
Right, no, but it's about the mechanics behind how these things work.
Understanding the devices of comics and how it is you can do things that indicate what is happening and how you want to do it, and the meanings that you're putting into things that you didn't know you were doing,
exactly.
I guess.
Well, I mentioned earlier the transitions aspect, and we were looking at this a little earlier, is that he lays out kind of 6 kind of styles of transitions, so that there's, from panel to panel, they can go either from subject to subject. So I go from a panel of me to a panel of Josh. Or I can go action, where it's a panel of me going like this to Conor, and then the next panel is me punching Conor.
Right.
And what then he can do, and he lays out these 6 different types of transitions, and then you can look at comics, and he graphs them out by the percentage of the comic by counting the panel to panel.
And he does that by creator.
Yes, which is
style.
Fantastic. So Claremont Lee X-Men #1,
right.
The action to action panels were like 65%,
right.
Whereas the subject to subject were smaller, and it's fascinating to see
then
how
he goes and he does it with Japanese comics and things like that. It's really, really interesting. One of the things is, I gotta say this actually really, he mentions Kirby a bunch of times, and it really, like when Kirby started doing things, the changes that...
Did it reinforce the importance of Kirby?
Very much so. Very, very much so. And then before that, Eisner.
Jack Kirby.
It's funny is
classic
that...
penciler from Marvel.
Right, of course. The creator, co-creator.
The king.
A Fantastic Four king,
Yeah. And Captain America, way before that.
Yeah, the 40s.
But so basically he goes through a bunch of artists at one point. It's like, this is this person's strength, this is what this one does, and the last one is Eisner. Well, he does all that. It's really... And he talks about like how Eisner did pages that had no borders.
Yep.
He was the first and kind of only person to do that, and what that means, and because there were no gutters or panels, and there's a really interesting bit on what the panel is. And this is stuff I read comics all the time, and I don't think of this.
And it's really funny because when you look at like in the panels and the page layouts, and like with modern comics, I mean, as creators continue to push the envelope of the medium, they play with the layouts and stuff like that. And quite often, some criticisms we hear of stuff is that like, too confusing. Like Powers is something that comes to mind, or Bendis and Omi
you were all over the page.
This kind of helps to, it doesn't help, but it kind of explains those more kind of barrier breaking kind of layouts where it's like, okay, the eye naturally wants to go to the upper left to start. So starting there, how do you control the page, the flow, so you know where to go in the panels? And it's really kind of,
he suggests at one point, he said, it is up to an artist. And when I say artist, I mean the combination of the writer and the artist.
Creator.
But it's up to the creator to decide how easy they want that page to be for you to navigate. Now, it could be said that they want to make something that's a little challenging for you that causes you to think of something else, and that could be because they're doing it on purpose or because they're unskilled. It sort of could go either way. And so I tend to think with those Bendis things, like, maybe he's wanting to throw you into a little bit of a tailspin, just try to understand. Maybe I'm completely wrong and I'm making up excuses for him, but
it's interesting to see how everybody's played. Like I know McFarlane, when he was doing Spawn, he did do that where he'd have the big picture and then a bunch of different boxes, and how do you know which box to read and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, it's just interesting.
I think that since this has come out, I'm looking at it and then thinking of the older comics that I read from when I was younger, from before this came out. Yeah. I really think this made a gigantic impact on the way that things were done, if not necessarily directly, then indirectly, because
this became required reading in the mid-'90s. I mean, when this came out, like I remember that was one of the reasons why I stole it, was because I heard so many people talking about it. I'm like, well, fuck, I should read this, So
shit, I don't know why I'm not reading it,
man.
So you stole it from the library.
Okay, let's take another example here. You really want to watch a movie, but you don't have a movie to watch. Problem solved. Okay, if you go to netflix.com/iFanboy, first of all, you get a 2-week free trial, but we'll get to that in a minute. But you get a selection of over 90,000 titles to choose from. There are no late fees, there are no delivery fees, you just pick what you want, and presto, they appear in your mailbox. Okay, that's like understanding how to rent a movie. Okay, netflix.com/iFanboy, 2-week free trial. And while you're getting things delivered to your mailbox, you should head over to jinx.com/iFanboy. There you can get a nice fancy iFanboy t-shirt. It's just like being an iFanboy. Almost, sort of. I guess. So, does that all make sense? Do you understand it all now? Great.
But so now the success of this, just briefly, led to Reinventing Comics, which was the second book, which then took this a step further, saying, okay, now that we know how comics have historically done, how can we change them, or how can we move forward with them?
I haven't read this, so sell me.
Well, no. Well, it's
no. Go ahead.
It's the next. It's the next step. It talks a lot about online comics. Scott Mccloud's done a lot of work. You want to talk the question about how do web comics work, stuff like that? I remember in the late '90s on Scott Mccloud's site, which I believe is scottmccloud.com.
I think so.
Or net or something, org.
Let's see.
He did an entire comic online in the late '90s where it was just a panel per click. And you read a panel and you clicked, and another panel, and then he did another one that was a really long scroll, and he's messed with the medium and online a lot.
He did a digital comic about Abraham Lincoln, which he says people don't like.
I loved it.
Oh yeah,
yeah. But I'm drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
But he talks a lot more in this about computers and about film and stuff like that, and about how we can use computer graphics and how we can meld them into still making comics, because he does believe that they are good tools that can be used to make comics.
Is this as focused? As understanding comics really is a very nice work. There's 6-7 chapters, and it's very well thought out, very well structured.
Yeah, it is as well structured. I mean,
understandable.
Yes, I think. But whereas understanding comics was more kind of lecturing and explaining, this is a little bit more pontificating and challenging.
Right.
So I liked it. I mean, it was good. I mean, I bought this one to make up for the stealing.
No, I was going to ask you guys a question. I'm looking at these books now, and on the cover, the subheading is "The Invisible Art."
Yeah.
What does that mean?
That refers to the idea of there's a lot going on in comics.
So it's happening behind.
No, that you're taking for
gutters.
granted as a reader that you're filling in the blanks on.
See right
you're bringing your own
brain.
experience to it.
So it's the in-between stuff happening in your head.
Yes, and that's what's amazing about comics, is that it's not being laid out for you.
This book made me realize it takes a lot of work to read comics. Like it's very stimulating, and because not only are you reading the words, but you're applying the emotion.
Is that naked Scott McCloud?
No, it's the classic jumping video. He put his head on it. No, but you're reading the words and you're applying the emotion and the brevity of the events to the people doing it, and then you're connecting the words emotion to the way the faces are drawn. Then you're connecting that to the actions in the panel, and then you're connecting that to making the panels read sequentially correctly to make sense.
You can see why some people just don't wrap their heads around comics. Some people just can't do it.
The other side of that
though
is that when he makes the point that when you're a kid, the first thing you connect with are pictures, and then eventually you end up with words and pictures, where there'll be a storybook and
a kid's book,
and then eventually they phase out pictures, and then people just read books, and then eventually,
or they don't.
Well, he makes that point too. But he's saying that doesn't have to happen because this medium is so universal. Some pages don't need words on them. It doesn't mean that they're not written. It doesn't mean that. It's just that it's such a universal language, and in a way that nothing else is, and it exists on its own. It can be anything, just like TV and film can be anything. And you walk out of it feeling really, not walking, but you finish it, and you're like, he's right. There's anything you can do with this. The sky's the limit.
Did this make you want to go make comics?
Absolutely. Although it scared the hell out of me. I was like, I'm not that good. But,
then you should read his third volume, Making Comics.
The other thing about it
which we haven't read.
The other thing about it is, though, that the sad part, though, is that this was written in 1992 and it came out in 93. Not much has changed. He makes a lot of examples of mainstream comics being big superhero comics, which is still the case. Now, there was indie work there, and there's more diversity now, but still, we're still stuck in this idea where the people who are making comics are aiming to make comics like the ones that came before, rather than
they're not reinventing.
But I think that's a problem with any medium. I mean, you look at TV. I mean, every sitcom is trying to recreate Out of the Blue Sea, basically. Like the success.
There's a whole other show we don't have time to do.
Well, sure. Anyway, but so
also let's talk about the history of the U.S. economy really quickly.
So anyway, but I mean, so that's not. I mean, that makes sense. I'm just babbling.
But basically, he hints at this giant untapped potential for comics, and it's sad to me that I don't feel like we've advanced enough since this.
Well, yeah, but I mean, McCloud.
15 years in the grand scheme of things is not a long time.
Not in terms of how long comics have been around, though.
Since the 60s.
It's almost like we've taken a step back with what they can do.
Since the 60s, since the 30s.
30s and 40s. Yeah.
Well, he goes back to the late 1800s with Toffler, I believe.
Cool.
Well, I have to say
that
that before this show, I thought, there's no reason for me to read this book because I don't need to. But now I think I do.
I think you do.
I think that's successful in that sense.
All right. Huzzah! McCloud is a huge comics fan. He loves making the comics and he loves reading them.
It's a gang sign.
Actually, he was a childhood friend of Kurt Busiek.
Yes.
He's a childhood friend of Kurt Busiek, so comics are very much ingrained in his life, and it's just really cool to see that love come out on this page and in an educational kind of way.
He still lectures. He goes around the country. Yep. He does, he does his website. He pontificates. Coined the term 24-hour comic.
I was just gonna say he coined the term and a huge supporter of the 24-hour comic, where you try to make a comic in 24 hours, and a lot of great Eric Larson's done it. A lot of great people have done it, and they put out books, the 24-hour comic books, and his website is awesome, scottmccloud.com, I hope. And it's got a lot of really experimental webcomics and stuff like that, so you definitely should check it out.
So if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to send an email, we are at contact@ifanboy.com.
You had to think about that, didn't you?
Just for a second. For a minute.
It was the URL I couldn't remember. Contact at Yahoo. No.
If you want to leave us a voicemail, you can call 1-888-FANBOYS, which is 326-2697. Leave us a voicemail about comics or whatever. We use them here in the audio. Here and the audio show. So.
And if you want to talk about this with some other folks, you can head over to ifanboy.com, where there'll be a discussion of this site. You can also go to discussion of this show. And you can also go to revision3.com/ifanboy, where there's discussion going on in there in the forums. And you can go check it all out there and see our other previous episodes and that sort of thing. So super cool. If you like comics and you haven't read this, we strongly recommend it.
I think it's for people who really enjoy the medium.
Yeah, and also if there's someone who struggles reading it, give it to him, see if it works. So.
Alrighty.
Cool. Thanks, Josh.
What did I do? Three.
You're not opening it.
2.
Oh, I'm not opening? I thought I was running the show.
I will.
Yeah,
oh, he's opening?
You
Okay.
don't know.
You count.
I can't keep track. I need a map.
Again, we've been doing this show for a year.
Over.